How to build a bay window like this, which is not fully symmetrical, because it has 3 windows in the center and only 2 on the sides, so we cannot simply use the array modifier here. These are the base dimensions I will use. We can also extrude a little bit at the top, since there is a small ceiling trim. Otherwise, I would start by adding 2 edge loops in the center and 1 on each side. Each represents a separate window. In Face Select mode, I select these faces where the windows will go by holding Ctrl pressed. Then I press I for Inset. I will quickly adjust the dimensions so they do not get in the way. So I press I once and possibly a second time I while in the Inset tool. This way, you separate each window individually, and then I do another inset to create geometry for the frame. Now it does not matter if individual is enabled in the inset, since the windows are already separated. Now I extrude the whole thing. With a right click, I cancel the movement of the extrude and press Alt-S for Shrink Fatten to push it out. Do not forget, the geometry of the extrude remains even after cancelling. Now, I will separate these windows with P. I save them to the clipboard with Ctrl-C. Then undo. Why? So I can keep them selected in the original and do not have to reselect everything. Now I can paste them with Ctrl-V. I hide this for now, and we need the new object for later, because I press Ctrl-Shift, Numpad plus, and select more. Now I can select the edge with Select Loops, Boundary of Selected. Then I can bevel the whole thing. I will give it about 13 bevel segments. In the Bevel menu in the Profile tab, I set Custom and then use this preset, for example. This saves me from having to reselect. To make this stick out a bit, I press Ctrl-Shift, Numpad plus, then press E. In Face Select mode, I try to push it a bit with Shrink Fatten. However, this might be a bit problematic because I push everything. But I only want to push this edge. How can we achieve this? I press Ctrl plus, then Select Loops, and then Boundary of Selected. We can also right-click on it and Add to Quick Favorites, because we need this often. You can open the Quick Favorite menu with Q. And now I can try to select it again by pressing Ctrl plus, but unfortunately it does not work because the faces are connected. I don't want the midsection to push out. That is why I will now try Select Less, which works if I undo again. This face is not selected. Ctrl plus and the face is selected. There is basically no selection gap anymore. If I now press Ctrl minus, no faces around here will be deselected because there is nothing left from which it could deselect less. It is really hard to explain, but basically select more and select less work the same, just one with selection and one without. Now I can again use Extrude and Shrink Fatten to push out the frame, and then use our favourite Boundary of Selected to select the edges, which I will then bevel. But maybe this time a normal bevel with fewer segments. Be careful not to touch this part. So now we still have many individual panes on the window, meaning the lead segments. That is why I separated the panes as a separate object earlier. We can now just subdivide these. Probably the fastest way would be to manually add the cuts. But we can already use the knife tool by pressing K to extend these symmetrically centered edge loops. This works at the bottom, but unfortunately not at the top. And I assume if I do it like this, it will not get better either. There are too many segments. Sometimes, unfortunately, you still have to work manually. I can try again here in the same way. I will now bevel them until it does not work anymore. If we enable clamp overlap, they are clamping together now and cannot go further. Then we press M and do merge by distance. But they unfortunately need to be a bit smaller, so we now have to manually scale them here. But I think this was still a relatively quick method. So, how do we get the lead elements we want now? We start with an individual inset. I will show it again. A normal extrude is not ideal here. We have to push it with shrink fatten. That is why I cancel this movement after the extrude, but the faces still remain. Then Alt-S and push. And these are now basically our window frames. Alternatively, I would even recommend making the glass elements separately. Push them a bit with Alt-S. And for the lead elements, we now simply use solidify. And it looks like the elements still need a merge by distance. And now we have it a bit more dynamic. Meaning I can also push them back in a bit with Alt-S and give them a thickness. To select the other side of the panes now, I go into Vertex Select mode instead of Face Select mode, because if I invert the selection and I am in Face Select mode, the outer faces here will also be selected. But if I am in Vertex Select mode, they do not. So now I can deselect or delete this here, and then I have these parts. Of course, I can also bevel these. Now we have these gaps between the window frame and the lead elements. I would like to close them. You might think you can simply select the frames of the lead elements and scale them if you set individual pivot beforehand. But unfortunately, you get problems in the middle segments because the selection is connected. We need to scale according to the direction of the faces. And I can do this again with shrink fatten. To do this, we need to confirm the solidify modifier, but the others can stay as they are. Now we have the necessary faces to push the faces with Alt-S. Do not forget to enable even thickness here. Now I will make the remaining wall panels. I start with an edge loop here. For the sides, there is support for the windowsill or whatever this is. This element here will of course be pushed out with shrink fatten. Enable even thickness again. I will bevel the corner pieces, but not in the way you might think. I set the profile shape to 0 so the bevel goes inward, and only 2 segments. I temporarily remove the top and bottom faces from the earlier extrude so I can easily get symmetrical, equal length edges with one inset. I push the middle edge out again with Alt-S. It is really important here that there are no faces on the top and bottom. Otherwise, it will round off the vertices when pushing. Now, I bevel this element rounded again and add the top surface of the windowsill back. Baseboards are very easy to make with shrink fatten, and with select boundary of selected, I quickly get the edges selected that I want to bevel afterward. For the edge of the upper windowsill, I use the tools as usual. But here, I intentionally try to make these edges meet, which I then resolve with merge by distance. I always do this when geometry gets too close to avoid shading errors later. Here you need to go to Edge Select mode before Select Boundary of Selection, because the vertices are connected to each other. The usual bevel methods, some decoration here at the bottom. Normal rounding here at the top. Quickly add a bevel and weighted normal modifier for better visuals and smoother edges. The panels will now be a bit more interesting, but basically everything stays the same. I select what I want, use an Inset and enable individual, so they also become separate panels. Push out with Alt-S. Then Inset, Extrude, push in again, another inset for the panel. With Select More, I can easily get the edges I want to bevel, and so on. There is a small problem here because I also beveled the inner part, since the boundary loops were also selected. I can solve this by simply selecting more with Ctrl+, and then, since it is too much, selecting less with Ctrl-. Since the middle is now also selected, no more selection will be removed here. Add the trim at the top near the ceiling. If you forget to activate even thickness after shrink fatten, you can also activate offset even in the options window. And if you also add the ceiling next to the floor, you are basically done. Thanks for watching.